The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing Josh Gordon and substance abuse. So, no person, no player, or no substance abuse situation is ever quite the same, right? So we're going to probably do a series of different episodes at some point on substance abuse, because I think, you see a lot of diversity in people's experiences, and it's never quite alike. So I think there's a lot to glean from a lot of different players' experience when it comes to substance use or substance abuse. And this is obviously a huge issue, not just in sports, but globally. So today's focus is on Josh Gordon. A quick bio of Josh Gordon. He's a wide receiver in the NFL for the Seattle Seahawks. Previously played for the Cleveland Browns and the New England Patriots, and we're familiar with him a little bit. I was familiar with him anyway, but obviously when he came to the Patriots, we were front and center to understand what his path was, and how substance use and relapse was kind of taken center stage in his life in general, but also as a football player. So he played college football at Baylor and was selected by the Browns in the second round of the 2012 NFL supplemental draft. So the supplemental draft is for players whose eligibility was impacted somehow, preventing them from entering the regular draft. I think for him, I want to say when he was at Baylor, he got suspended because of multiple infractions or violations with substance use or failed drug tests. He then transferred to Utah, but I think he narrowly missed applying for the 2011 supplemental draft. Then went to Utah, sat out the whole season, and entered the 2012 supplemental draft to get drafted in the NFL. So a few random facts about Josh Gordon. He led the league in receiving yards in the 2013 NFL season and made first-team All-Pro that season. I think that was his rookie season. That's the only season he played every game. After that, it was I think he missed 43 of 48 of the next games for the Browns because of the substance abuse issues, which is quite a lot. He is of Haitian descent. In high school, he played football, basketball, and ran track. He ran the 4x100 and the 4x200. John, I'm not a track expert, but I think those are sprints?
Sprints.
Relay sprints?
Relay sprints.
Awesome. Thank you for helping me out. Although he was recruited for football by many schools, he in part chose Baylor due to a probation issue in the state of Texas. He lived in the state of Texas and really wasn't allowed to leave, I think. So he was recruited by non-Texas colleges outside of Texas, but just really couldn't do that, so he had to go to Baylor. He transferred, like we said, to the University of Utah, sat out the 2011 season. So, we didn't have a specific charitable organization in mind, but I did put a link in the show notes to the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, so that in case people want to look into that or donate, obviously this is a huge issue globally, but especially in the United States with the opioid crisis, things like that, which we're not really going to get into as much today, but that will be its own episode. So, John, before we get into the player spotlight, what's your familiarity with Josh Gordon before doing prep for this episode?
I knew the Flash, right? I think he had a lot of hype coming out of it. Coming out of the draft. I think there was always sort of some stuff surrounding behavior stuff, and substances was sort of like in his atmosphere. There was a lot of expectations that were on him coming up, and he knew he was going to be the big talent that was coming through. He was a big, tall, fast wide receiver.
Yeah, 6'4", I think,
6'4", right? 6'3", 6'4", and fast. So
and in impeccable shape. I mean, if you look at the guy, he doesn't have an ounce of fat on him. He's clearly just in really, really good shape.
Yeah, so that was a lot of him coming out that just there was this big aura of excitement sort of around him. He had some stuff that was sort of the baggage he was kind of bringing along with him, but there was a lot of stuff coming with him. So I was always sort of excited. I admittedly knew about the track stuff too, because that's obviously some stuff that I'm a little bit more privy to because I was a track athlete. So I'm always interested in that type of stuff. To hear that. So That was mostly me just really excited to see what he could do. I'm not much of a college football follower, so I didn't really watch too many games of him, at Utah or anything like that, but just excited to see him, come up and sort of see what he could do. And then that rookie season really delivered. And like you said, was sort of most receiving yards that year. So, that was my understanding. I knew that there was some stuff and behavioral issues, I think was one of the ways that he was described sort of coming through. So I knew that stuff was coming up sort of around him. But
yeah, I didn't know much about him. I kind of remember him being drafted in the supplemental draft and hearing the whole thing you hear with a lot of situations like this in sports, has all the potential in the world. I think we heard that as a cliche, nonstop. And it kind of, I'll get to that in a second because I think from what I remember of him is that the most is that 2013 season because he came in, people talking about potential, and he just crushed it. I remember my brother had him on his fantasy team and just destroyed our league because he had him and I think one other wide receiver, maybe Des Bryant that year, if my memory serves me correctly.
Money.
You always remember the losses more than the wins, right, Johnny?
It's true.
My brother Trevor, just absolutely crushed our league that year. So that's neither here nor there because my main point is that I think it's easy to have as a takeaway in these situations, the cliche kind of what a waste of potential, right? I think that's just such a, it's an easy place for people to go when they're talking or reflecting on Josh Gordon, and I just think it's kind of bullshit because he's a person, and we can talk about his status as an athlete or what he could have been versus what he ended up being or any of that stuff, but at the end of the day, you learn about this guy, and this is before we even did research for this episode. I mean, my main takeaway about Josh Gordon was just feeling for the guy, just not about football, really just about this guy's clearly been through a lot. I hope he's able to get to a point where he's got peace in his life and he's consistently healthy, knowing what substance abuse is so hard, addiction and recovery is so hard, and relapse is always part of the process. So that was, has always been how I viewed him, is just hoping that he's happy in a good place, regardless of what other people are saying about him or, whether people consider him a waste of potential and all that crap that we hear all the time. Yeah. So to get into our takeaways, I think the first one for me, is that I'm going to kind of start at the end a little bit, and then, you and I are going to work our way back more to the beginning of his timeline, but, he clearly has bought into getting better, and you can tell by the way he talks now. I think the language he uses, and I think this came through also with a little bit with Michael Phelps and Kevin Love to a degree, where the way they talk about learning how to communicate at age 30, and the language matters, and the words they use are clearly a product of them getting help and them learning about whether it's substance abuse or mental health or emotional, the language of emotion, sort of raising their emotional IQ a little bit, their EIQ. You can tell by the way Josh Gordon talks that he has gotten a lot of help and support, and he is buying in. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee to getting healthy right away, but he's clearly bought in, right? So he's become more and more proactive about putting his health over football, which I think is great.
Yeah.
It's so easy for people to just be like, dude, you're a football player. Prioritize the team, get on the field, do whatever.
Just play.
Yeah, it's these are human beings. If they're not in a good place in terms of their life, we're talking life and death with some of these things. And who gives a shit about football? I'm sorry, but that's really what it comes down to. So he was able to, see his strengths. I think it came through, him being able to see his strengths even through the struggles in response to his critics. And one thing in particular came up where in 2015, I didn't see exactly what the criticisms were. I know it involved maybe Charles Barkley and Stephen A. Smith and maybe a couple other people, in the media making comments about him, negative, judging him, that kind of thing, something along those lines. And he said that, this isn't a perfect quote, I'm paraphrasing, but he succeeded by escaping, he's talking about himself, I succeeded by escaping a youth riddled with poverty, gang violence, and very little in the way of guidance or support. I succeeded by narrowly avoiding a life of crime that managed to sink its clutches into almost all of my childhood friends. I succeeded by working tremendously hard on my craft and my body to even have a chance to play professional football for a living. So to me, that kind of gave me chills just even reading that, because it's it's easy to really go after this guy for the mistakes he's made or the slip-ups and the relapses. But you can see based on what he was up against, there's no way you can spin this other than a huge success. To get where he got, it's full of strengths in his ability, doesn't have to be defined by what he did wrong. So I know you have more information on the media side. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that was my biggest takeaway from doing these different things. The article or the letter that he wrote to his critics, I thought was really profound and powerful. And we'll have it in the show notes. And I encourage anyone to go through and read that, because I think it really highlights one of the biggest gaps that we see in sports media. I think that's why this podcast in particular is so important, because we're trying to shed light on these types of issues for people to like humanize athletes. We've talked about in previous podcasts before, if we put these athletes up on pedestals and we sort of make them inhuman, that they're supposed to be perfect, they have to be all these different things. And I think everyone in sports media is looking for like that hot take, right? And I think for the most part they're negative, right? They're for Josh Gordon, I think Stephen A. Smith made comments about like, I'm done with him, right? Or I'm so over Josh Gordon. And, he had no context. He had no understanding. He didn't get into any of that type of stuff. And I think that's why there's such a blind spot for this work with what we're trying to shine light on. There is a lot of other information that we had they didn't cover, they didn't talk about, they didn't try to put context to it, and I think that's a major problem in sports media. And this Josh Gordon is certainly not the only example. In future episodes, we're going to get into Dak Prescott a little bit, but this was just more recently. Skip Bayless made comments about him being outspoken about depression and those types of things, and these athletes are victimized for speaking about their mental illness. And I think that is just the absolute wrong approach, because a lot of young guys especially look up to these athletes as their role models of how they're supposed to dictate behavior or what they're supposed to do when they feel like they're struggling. And then they see them try to speak up about what they're working through, and then they're just beaten back down. And I think that's a real big problem with sports media in particular. And I think it needs to shift and change. And I think that's part of one of the main purposes for this podcast, is to start to continue to push that change, because you're just going to get more and more examples. I think we've seen more examples of athletes coming up and speaking about these different things, which has been powerful. I still see a huge gap and a lag in the sports media side coming in and supporting athletes coming up and talking about these things, rather than just, the concept, shut up and dribble, or just play football, or all these different things, which I think also deeply seated in racist beliefs as well, totally. But also completely irrelevant for what's going on. This person's trying to talk about something that's really important and being completely shunned aside. It's a real problem and continues to be pretty pervasive.
Yeah, or at least these networks like ESPN or other places, at least be informed about what you're talking about. Like, I'm not saying they necessarily always have to give athletes a platform to come on and talk about this stuff, because I know they have limited time. But like at least have the people that are on your shows have a limited understanding of what the hell is going on from the mental health side thing. Because I think if you look at the kind of the timeline or the trajectory or the evolution of of pro sports, it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, right? I think it's probably what led to organizations like ESPN getting as big as it did throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. It started more from just a strictly sports perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Then you just started to get people that veered off a little bit more into covering, think like sports reporters, right? Covering like sports and pop culture and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And that's grown. I think as the sports have grown, the platforms of these athletes and where they fall with regard to popular culture and everyday life of the fans has grown, right? Never more than it is today, right? So like and it continues to grow. And part of that is about live sports and how live sports fits into the on-demand culture, and that's the only thing left that people. That's why advertisers pay so much. The only thing left that is guaranteed people are going to watch it when it's happening.
Yep.
Nothing else really fits that category. You can always DVR stuff, or you can watch it on demand or whenever you want, right?
Binge watch, whatever.
Yes. Yep. Nothing else fits the category of like, nope, I could DVR that, but no one wants to watch sports when it's recorded. No one wants to watch that. So it's led to these, the platforms growing, salaries growing, salary caps growing. Like the leagues have exploded because the TV deals are so expensive. Mm-hmm. And so for better or worse, I mean, that's brought pro sports and pro athletes into another echelon of awareness and of being in the limelight for others. And you've started to see like the race discussion and some political discussions come into the sports world. That was very controversial over the last couple of years with ESPN. And when should ESPN touch on this? Should they not?
Yep.
You had a lot of conflicting kind of factions on different sides of that argument. And I think personally, it's a good thing. Do I think it needs to be kind of limited at times? Absolutely. I don't think it should become all about that, but you can't ignore it either. You have to talk about that stuff.
Yep.
I think mental health is the same thing. To me, for whatever reason, because I agree with you, they still haven't gotten to that point where none of these shows
So
really
far behind.
even like attempt to talk about this stuff. Maybe it's because they don't get it. But that needs to happen. I think that's if I had to guess, I think that's the next step where I feel like these networks need to have somebody, whether it's like behind the scenes talking to the people that are on the shows so that they understand the mental health angle, or have someone on the, expert on the show at times. I feel like people would eat that up because I think it's very interesting. I think that's why, again, we wanted to do this podcast because I think people buy into this stuff, right? It affects you on an everyday basis. They look up to athletes. They want to learn about these examples, and I think it makes fandom a little bit more balanced, right? I know fan is short for fanatic, but I always find that it's even more enjoyable to watch sports when you know something about the players and you can connect with them on more than just a sports level, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why it's so important. I think 2 points. One would be that mental health is still talking about these issues is still sort of the exception, not the rule for a lot of these platforms, and I think we need to switch that completely.
Totally.
And you make a really great point that I think it's really important that we understand the person. Right, we understand these people. I think from the fan's point of view, it makes it much more relatable, and you want to sort of root for the person that you have a little bit more of an understanding for. And so I know we'll talk now about sort of this history kind of coming through the league. And
it's ironic because I want to touch on one more thing related to that point, John, because as fans, we want to know more about the player too. But ironically, if these leagues, if the GMs and the owners actually give a shit about getting the right players, they should care about this too. I mean, this is not like when you go and do a combine, you're testing physical attributes, right? Can you sit here and tell me that the mental health side is not at least close to as important? I don't know if say equally as important as like their performance on the field, but like it's a huge factor, right? You can, how many times do we hear people talking about whiffs in the draft and stuff like that and character issue? They didn't see stuff like. You need to have an awareness about their mindset, their mental health, things like that. It not as a way to exclude them, but as a way to be aware of the player as a whole, so that when they're coming in, you know what needs to be done to put them in a position to succeed. If you're not paying attention to that stuff at all, you are missing a huge. Like we know how analytics have come into sports in the last 10, maybe 20 years. To me, a mental health awareness is still something that's lacking when it comes to just the assessment of players and understanding how to put them in the best position to succeed. I don't think that has even remotely scratched the surface of
no, and I don't think it's at the point yet where I think it feels like it's like almost like 80-20, 80% on like physical attributes, 20% on sort of there. But the mental component or the mental side of an athlete is never. At least my understanding, obviously I'm not a GM behind the curtain making these big decisions, but usually not the deciding factor of whether or not they should draft someone. Actually, you hear quite on, and with Haskins at DC, this year, perfect example where everybody except the GM was talking about, we don't really think that this is going to be a good fit for this person on this team, and then still went ahead and got it, and then you saw the what happened because of that. It needs to be a part of that evaluation process to make sure that this person is going to be like an actual contributor to the team and mentally and sort of fits in and buys into what they're going to have to do. And it's just not there yet. Yeah,
because it could be, at times, the one small fear I have is that it will only be used as an exclusionary criteria.
Agreed.
So we don't want that. But I think at times maybe they have to use it disclusionary to because sometimes the player has to realize like this. For them to make changes, I don't want to say like every player, whether it's a substance abuse issue or otherwise, has to hit quote unquote rock bottom. But sometimes players have to have limits set so that they're able to see like, well, if this prevented me from getting drafted, then maybe I got to look in the mirror and change some things. So I think I'm afraid that it's only going to be used for disclusionary criteria, but I think at times it needs to be. And even when it's not, I think a balanced way is at times for reasons for disclusion, but at times for reasons of just being aware of the player and to say, okay, we're aware of these things. Do we have people on staff that are aware and that know how to greet him or her when they come into the building to put them in a position to be successful as an athlete on this team? Because I think that even if you don't use it for disclusionary reasons, it could be a way to set them up for success. And you talked about the 80-20. I don't know what – it's definitely not 50-50, right? No. I think the physical piece is always going to be more important. So maybe it's 80-20, maybe it's 90-10, maybe it's 95-5. But these sports are, how often do you hear the phrase like a game of inches? The margin for success between someone who is like at the top of their game in college and never succeeds in the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball or any of these sports versus one that is at the top of their game in college and does is so narrow. You're telling me that even if it is just 5%, that would make a huge difference because the margin is less than 1% in terms of some of these people. So Yeah, to me, that's something where like I think it's a missed opportunity so far.
I agree. I think you make a really, really good point about how these players could be welcomed in and supported rather than I think it's definitely a fear that we've talked about sort of off air, and maybe we'll have a future session on it, but like weaponizing mental health, right, and using it as something that's sort of like, well, this person has this, so we don't want them on that team. That's not what we're looking for. We want to say this person is dealing with this. How do we support that person so they can maximize their talents while they're with us, and then having a person on staff to be able to actually do that work. I think it doesn't have to be like, okay, well, they have this, so they're not going to be a good fit. So this is the reason why we're going to exclude them. It should be, okay, this is what they're dealing with coming through the door. Do we have the resources to support that athlete?
Yeah.
And I think that's the shift in perspective that needs to happen for these athletes.
For sure. Yeah. So did you have any takeaways about this start of his kind of journey?
Yeah, I
Josh
think Gordon? Yeah, you made the earlier point about trying to the importance of understanding the person, and I think and you touched on he grew up in sort of a harder area of Houston, and he's been pretty open about his upbringing and his history with substance abuse, and he talks about middle school was when it really sort of started for him, and he's talked about he used it because he didn't want to feel fear, he didn't want to feel anxiety, and we've talked about this before in previous episodes about like the idea of like self-medicating, right? It is quick, easy, and addictive to use substances as a way to numb out or to not feel or to not address or to to cope with what's going on. And he talks a lot about being in poverty, a lot of crime he was surrounded by, and weed, particularly in marijuana, was something that just like he talks about, like everybody just did it.
Yep.
That was one thing that really stood out to me, that I think sometimes we think of it of like, I think for him it was multiple. And then in 2019 he lost his brother, and I think that contributed to his relapse.
Yeah.
And so definitely sometimes there are events that lead to substance abuse, at least in the beginning, and he does talk a little bit about some situations with trauma when he was younger, but sometimes it's just like the environment and circumstance, like everybody around him, his support network at the time, where everybody was just using it. That was just normal, right, for everyone to be doing that. So I think that was the big thing when we talk about different resources of ways to support, but the concept of self-medicating through substances is one of the ones that comes up almost every single time when working with people, from a clinical side point, who are dealing with substance abuse and substance usage, that's typically the response to something that is not wanting to be dealt with. And it's a lot easier to get high and forget and to not have to do those types of things. I think that for him, I think that's a lot of where things started. And then that was his default for years.
Yeah.
And then to just expect someone to just not do that without any guidance. He talks about that a lot, having no guidance or no sort of support or help of like where he should be. He had a single mom kind of growing up, two other brothers. Imagine it was probably pretty hectic in there.
Who left at one point. I think
Right.
that's also when he started to struggle even more, because those were probably his, closest thing to support or role models he had. And once they had left, that's when, things really started to get dicey. And one point you made that really stood out for me too is just the kind of concept of modeled behavior, and that's a jargony term. So what that means is, what are you exposed to? What are you around when you're growing up? Right? You're a kid. Like you can't make decisions for yourself. You don't know how to be self-sufficient. That's the whole point. That's why you're not legally an adult till you're 18. Is that you're supposed to have a period of development, multiple stages of development, where your brain is forming and you're understanding how to live life. If people who are modeling behavior for you or showing you how to act, showing you how to live during that time, are the norm with those people is all unhealthy acts, all unsafe acts, drug use, alcohol use, things like that. That's what you learn. I mean, that not only is it the norm, but it's what you learn, right? It's how you learn to cope. And so it's very easy for people on the outside looking in to be like, yeah, well, I see people blame people with substance abuse so often. It's like,
all the time.
Oh, he's not strong enough. I mean, like,
right,
he
just
gets
stop.
Just make better choices. It's like, okay, I'd love to see some people that say that grow up in a house without running water, without heat, where everyone's using drugs to cope with everything, and see them come out without a substance abuse issue. Because it's a lot easy to say that when you've never had to live it. But go back to being, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and grow up around that and tell me that it's easy to not be an addict when you grow up, because that's just the norm that you're around. And I think the other key point, this was definitely one of my main takeaways, it's just the percentage of people dealing with addiction who have underlying trauma.
Yes.
I think it's over 90%. It's massively high. And I think that the definition of trauma is evolving. It's come a long way. I think we're going to get into that next episode. We're going to talk about PTSD. But for people who have substance abuse issues, full-blown addiction issues, 90% or more, I believe, have underlying trauma issues from their past, whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. I mean, I think for him, he talked about how, like you said, he started self-medicating with Xanax in seventh grade.
Seventh grade.
Right, which is like, no joke,
Heavy duty.
let alone in seventh grade. Marijuana as well, even before that, and codeine, and then all that stuff together in middle school. And he said his initial use stemmed from, these are 4 things he said, and the 4th thing is the most important because it's what causes the first 3. He says social awkwardness, anxiety, feelings of inadequacy. Those are all caused by the 4th one, which is adolescent trauma-based fear.
Yep.
Okay, and for him, it was neglect and hunger. Okay, when you're neglected when you're a kid to the point where you're going hungry and you have no heat and you have no hot water, no idea what that does to a person's psyche. An adult, let alone a kid who's developing. Right. So that's extremely traumatic. Then there was gang violence. Right. And he moved around 7 times. I mean, we talk a lot about environment in our work and the importance of environment, physical environment, for consistency, for having a place you can call home.
Stability.
For stability. It gives you comfort. It gives you a kind of a backbone to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis.
A safe place.
Yes, a safe place and stability, like you said. To move around 7 times, even if he hadn't gone through the other things, I would say would put him at risk for developing some issues because there's just no consistency, no place you ever feel tied down to.
Right.
And I think that messes with a person's mind a little bit. So then when you add to that he went through neglect and hunger and gang violence, I mean, it's pretty easy to see why at an early age in middle school, this kid starts numbing himself just to get through the day because that trauma is what causes things like social awkwardness. It's what causes things like anxiety. It's what causes feelings of inadequacy. How could you feel adequate if you're a kid and you're looking around at the people who are supposed to protect you and you got nobody?
Right.
A kid doesn't know that that's not their fault. They're looking around, they're thinking it must be them, right? People have the tendency, I see people go 2 directions with this. I think most people tend to blame themselves far too much, and the rest of the people tend to blame others far too much. But I think most people tend to look in the mirror because it gives you a false sense of control. We need a reason. We need an explanation for what we've gone through. And most of the time we look in the mirror and we're like, well, I guess it must be me, right? And I think kids in the position Josh Gordon were in definitely tend to do that, right? They look around, they're like, well, I must be inadequate. I mean, what other explanation is there for this stuff that I'm dealing with? So I totally agree with you that was a huge takeaway. He joined a gang in high school. I would also say that relates to self-worth. I think a lot of times if you don't have support, if you don't have connection, and you feel like you're worthless, you're going to go join a bunch of other people that you think are, troubled people because you feel like that's where I belong.
Yeah.
Right? If your self-worth is low, let me go find the other people that everyone else is looking at as their self-worth is, they're worthless. I'm going to go join with them because that's where I belong.
And I think on the outside too, it's you've got immediate loyalty. Right.
Absolutely.
So you feel like these guys
point,
would,
yes.
and quite literally, and he talked about this too, like would kill somebody for me, right? And he might not have felt that level of support from
They'll
his own
support me,
family.
and no one else ever has.
Exactly.
Right?
So that's why it's so enticing.
Yep, absolutely. So he sold weed to feed himself. Again, think about that, right? You're in middle school and you have to sell weed just to get food. That it touches on a whole other level of neglect, right? He was drinking vodka during class and fortified wines before games to gauge his ability to play. To me, that's a clear-cut sign that the addiction is already leading the show. The addiction is such a liar, right? It really tells you what you need to hear to justify continued use. And this is where there's a huge difference between mind and brain. In our mind, we might think like, I got this covered. But our brain is an organ that is susceptible to addiction. And when the brain is addicted, it's going to convince the mind of what the mind needs to do to feed what the brain needs. Yes. Yeah. And so for him already, he's drinking fortified wine as a way to test the fence for weaknesses, so to speak, for a little Jurassic Park reference there. So he's trying to figure out, all right, I need this to survive. So I got to test out, what level can I push this to before games in order to be able to, keep doing what I got to do just to get by. So that to me, it's really sad to have someone have to get to that point where they're at such a young age already doing it. Because this was in high school. He's already doing that stuff before games. So again, underlying causes. Another thing that kind of stood out to me was the level of enabling that happened. And this is where it's like, when you look at the different stages of Josh Gordon's life, if we could do some flip-flopping and moving around, I think things would have been much different. And what I mean by that is, in the beginning of his life, he had no one there to support him, right? in the middle, in high school and in college, he had too much support in the form of enabling. People were just letting him get away. They're helping him cheat drug tests. They're letting him get away with anything. There was no lines being drawn because all they gave a shit about was his ability to play football. That's it. So there's you went from no support and total neglect to too much support in the form of letting him get away with anything. Horrible kind of like back, two-stage back to back.
Which you can argue isn't really support. Right.
Which it's not support. Yeah, it's like it's enabling. It's just too much open door. Like do whatever you want. As long as you're on the football
playing
field. Football
well.
Right.
That's
exactly.
It.
So it's support's the wrong word, but you know what I'm trying to say. So, and then at the NFL level, I think it kind of goes back to now they're holding him accountable, and it's like that's not the time. Like I find it shocking that they treat mental health issues and substance abuse like it's a crime in these professional sports when it shouldn't be. Anyone who's done treatment with someone with substance abuse, punishment is not going to help them. Shame and trauma usually is what drives their use. So if they're trying to succeed and they slip up, because relapse is part of the process, it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And you punish them, that's going to make it worse. I mean, now they're just going to feel worse about themselves. They're not going to learn anything. It's going to elevate the stress levels, which triggers them to probably want to use even more. So I just see these as such an unfortunate occurrence of stages where he needed more support when he was a kid. He needed more lines being drawn and limits being set when he was in high school and college. And then in the pros, it's like we need these leagues to be educating and understanding how to be tolerant of substance abuse and relapse, not finding them their entire game checks and suspending them. It's like that's not going to help, right? So
it just feeds the shame, like you mentioned.
Exactly. So to me, that came through. What other takeaways did you have?
Those were, I mean, the big ones for me. I think the sports media piece, the gap there. I think you make a really, really good point about at each individual sort of like stage of his life, there was a big missed opportunity for supporting, like actually supporting him and actually allowing like for proper treatment to happen. And again, another reason why this podcast is so important is to try to shine light on the importance of this isn't something that needs to be penalized, especially with addiction and substances. And we've seen massive spikes across the board during this pandemic with substance use in general. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to support. And there's a lot of big organizations that are really, really far behind. The NFL is one of them. And to penalize somebody for something that they're struggling with is counterintuitive almost.
Especially because if they had a physical injury,
they get all the services in the world. They're seeing the best doctors. They're seeing the best people.
They're not suspended. I mean, they're treated. They're treated, right?
Exactly. And these types of things aren't any different. And I think I'm not really sure. I can't speculate again to the minds of the people making the decisions for why penalty is the best approach for this. But I think it's a way for them to try to honestly, from a save face, right? They see substance abuse and drugs as a crime, and so they have to punish it as such, rather than this person is really struggling with something. That's why they are using. Let's come to terms with figuring out, okay, why are they using to begin with? How do we support that? Like you said, it's most likely trauma.
Yep.
How do we support and treat the trauma so that substance isn't the mechanism that they're using to treat themselves? And how do we do a better job of doing that rather than, let me just remove probably the single outlet that has been able to support them and penalize them financially, demonize them, feed the shame, increase the addiction. I mean, it's completely backwards now with how things are done. And I think that was my biggest one. I was really excited to do this podcast on Josh Gordon today, mainly just to be able to make that point and really drive that home that these big organizations approach these things very, very wrong, in my opinion, and there needs to be a lot of work done. I think that we've seen some organizations in some places making some movement. NBA is a good example. Now every single team has to have a mental health professional. I think there's been some movement. The NFL is probably last, honestly, in that thing, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help to support these athletes. And we'll do an episode on CTE and concussions and things like that. And I think the marijuana use is another piece for that. I think so. There's a lot of things that need to be done to help support these athletes, that these big billion-dollar organizations have it completely backwards, that need to be doing a better job.
Yeah, totally. I want to say the Players Association, maybe in the NFL, had negotiated a slightly different change to the way the substance abuse policy worked that was a little bit more lenient in understanding of like maybe like a substance abuse and more trauma informed kind of approach. That wasn't so heavy handed right off the bat, or maybe they got rid of like a 3-strike policy. There's something that I think they were able to make minor changes, but it's too little too late. They need to like really overhaul that and escalate stuff because it's just not good enough. A couple of things that stood out to me. One was that, with his substance abuse, it's not just how he coped with difficult emotions, it's also how he celebrated. I mean, he talks about this where it's like, this is some people struggle just to let themselves feel joy or question, whether they are deserving of joy or success. And so it's not just the people who are like, under stress or anxious and then they cope with it that way.
Right.
It's also some people that feel worthless and, they have something to celebrate in their life. I think he was trying to celebrate that he was 6 months sober. And he comments like, "Look, I went to celebrate the only way I know how. Like, this is how." Like,
right.
And that was his rock bottom. So we hear the term rock bottom in substance abuse a lot because, unfortunately, a lot of people with addiction issues often have to hit a rock bottom for them to realize that difference that we talked about earlier between the mind and the brain. Right? Mm-hmm. Again, the brain and the addictive part of the brain is going to convince the mind, or our version of ourself, that we're fine. Mm-hmm. And denial is huge with substance abuse, or lying to yourself. So sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before it kind of rattles them enough to be like, oh my God, like I've been lying to myself this entire time. I need to change something drastically. So that was when he hit rock bottom. He wanted to celebrate, his 6 months sober. And he did that by wandering around Gainesville, Florida, trying to find anyone. He was just trying to find the smell of weed so he could buy anything to like celebrate that. And that's when I think he knew, to him, that was his rock bottom. He checked himself into rehab right after that. So I thought that was really important to kind of mention that. He also discusses how, I liked how he put this when, we talked in the beginning of this kind of segment about how the way he's discussed things has really evolved, and he clearly is bought into kind of getting better. He talks about how he's failed himself.
Yeah. Instead
of being a failure, I think failing yourself means you starting to believe you deserve better. Mm-hmm. I think that's totally different than saying I've failed in my life. That means you think you're a failure as a person. Mm-hmm. He says, I failed myself when I started using marijuana regularly as a young teenager. And he talks about 4 other ways that he failed himself. And so he's starting to see, like, you know what? Forget everybody else. Like, I deserve better, and I'm letting myself down, and mm-hmm. I want to get better. Yeah. So I think it's great that he uses that language, because I think that's really key. And in that, not only is that key for that reason, but because he talks about how weed, he looks at a big failure to himself as starting to smoke weed at a very young age, as a young teenager. And so it's always been a huge bone of contention with me that weed, is being pumped up as this like totally safe thing for people to use, this safe alternative, this, it's better than alcohol. It's this, I do not believe that at all. I've worked with too many guys who cannot handle weed in their life, and it ends up turning them in, it takes them away from a healthy social life. It takes them away from goals they want to set and accomplish. It takes them away from day-to-day work ethic. The side effects of weed, the most common ones I see, are complete lack of work ethic, no motivation. I hate the term lazy, so I don't want to put that because it's a label and I don't like it, but no motivation, no work ethic whatsoever, and typically depression, right? It pulls them away from the stuff that's meaningful to them because they're just numbing themselves all day long, and now they got nothing positive in their life, and that's what leads to usually a dip in mood or a depressed state. And I want to kind of touch on Chris Long here a little bit because I know what Chris Long and guys like him are trying to do. Chris Long is a former NFL player. He played for the Rams for a long time. His father was Howie Long, who also was a football player for a long time, I think, on the Raiders. He's also on, I think, the Fox pregame show for the NFL. So Chris Long is his son. He's also got a brother named Kyle Long, I think. Yeah, played for the offensive lineman for the Bears, I think, for a long time. Yep. So Chris Long played for the Rams. He won a Super Bowl with the Patriots. And he won a Super Bowl with the Eagles. That's a Super Bowl I'd still like to forget. Yeah, I'm trying to pretend it never happened.
Move on.
Denial is going to help me in that section. But so he's been in the league for a long time, and he, I think, towards the end of his career, but especially since he retired, has become this very vocal advocate for legalizing marijuana. And I want to say, the NBA has stopped, kind of taken weed out. They don't test for weed anymore. Mm-hmm. Which is fine. I mean, I think I want to find the line here because I think for me, I don't think weed is a horrible thing. I just think it's not accurate to pump it up the way Chris Long has. Chris Long has said that, quote, this is a quote, "We should be headed to a place where we allow players to enjoy what I would not even call a drug. It's far less dangerous than guzzling a fifth of alcohol and going out after a game." I think I know where he's I know where he's coming from.
Yeah.
Right? He's trying to in the context of a professional sport, right, where you have these athletes making a lot of money who are especially in football, they're sacrificing their bodies to a ridiculous degree. You touched on
Brain
concussions
especially.
and stuff, right,
Yeah.
which we'll definitely get into in a later episode. So it's in the context of pro football where these players do not always, they don't have guaranteed contracts, and they're trying to play through pain, and they're, for a long time it was like they were kind of steered towards like, hey, prescription meds, painkillers, guzzle those or guzzle alcohol.
Yep.
But if you fail a drug test for weed, forget about it. You're suspended. And it did, I think, drive players to use alcohol and prescription meds instead of weed, whereas weed is a slightly better alternative to those things. Well, maybe even significantly better in the scope of just addiction issues, like especially compared to prescription medications and opioids and things like that.
Right.
Maybe not as much alcohol. So I get where he's coming from because he wants the NFL to be like, hey, if we're going to make these people sacrifice their bodies and maybe future health physically, for a short career, we should at least let them cope with their physical pain with weed, because weed has come a long way in terms of its legality and being shown to be used as a pain reliever.
Sure.
Correct?
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
So I get what he's doing. What he doesn't I haven't seen him talk about this, but what I think he needs to realize is that he's not just speaking to a couple thousand NFL players or the NFLPA or Roger Goodell. He's speaking to every young athlete out there that's listening to him talk and that has that mind-brain relationship we just talked about, where their brain's trying to convince their mind that weed's okay.
Yeah.
Right? I can't tell you how many young guys I work with who are in denial about their weed use and are trying to convince themselves it's fine, no big deal, I can use
Right.
every day and still succeed.
Yeah.
And they can't.
Well,
and
the
it
Chris
never
Long,
works.
that's what I hear. Like, it's better than guzzling a fifth, right?
I've heard tons of young guys actually say his name.
You're right, and I think that's the danger. I think the one thing that doesn't get talked about is that from like a brain develop, like a neurological standpoint, guys particularly, our brains, the rational part of our brain, right, the front part of our brain. Yeah. I'm gonna jargon, prefrontal cortex, right behind your forehead. That doesn't fully develop until you're mid 20s.
Yeah, 25,
for guys.
26,
25 is like the average time where people start to, like, for guys, the brain develops, and smoking marijuana directly hinders the development of that, right? Females, it's a little bit sooner, but same thing. I mean, starting off with, in middle school, smoking weed, and then sort of hearing maybe someone you're idolizing saying, like, this is a better option than drinking, it's irresponsible in one way because he doesn't get into sort of the real.
He doesn't balance it out.
It's just like this is good, needs to be good, and I think there are definitely arguments to be made, and I think that there are definitely people who benefit from marijuana use when it's prescribed from a doctor at a time that needs to, like for cancer patients. I know it can be helpful with pain relief and adding some appetite, but for a 14-year-old kid, like you said, who's trying to rationalize or make it like, give themselves permission and be like, well, Chris Long said that it's okay and it's better to do this than to do that, without any context of it's irresponsible and needs to be more development. I with you, same thing for me. I try to toe the line of, I think as people, we tend to jump from one end of the spectrum to the other and have a hard time finding the balance. And I think that there is balance to be had with marijuana use and especially, but it's not this demon terrible drug, but it's also not this saving grace that's going to cure everything.
Yes.
There is a balance to what needs to be happen, but you go too far towards like, this is okay, and let's just allow this to happen, and you're on a platform where millions of people are listening to you, is really, really dangerous, and you need to be a little bit more educated or be educated on what you're saying and the impacts you might be having with, especially the younger youth, where their brain physically cannot make a rational decision around that. And then when they do choose to use marijuana, hinders the ability for the growth of that to happen to continue to make better ones.
And they're not using it for pain relief.
No.
These young kids are not using it because they're like high-powered athletes.
Pleasure.
You're right. They're using it to, I think this is how the scale, not the scale, but the graph, kind of the path of substance use and addiction takes hold, right? It starts with using for pleasure. But I wish maybe I'll put something in the show notes that links to like a graph on this, because in the beginning, when a person uses, the pleasure goes up. So the time is short. You've just started using. Pleasure is really high. It never gets higher than that. It starts to dip and then it goes down forever because your body and brain become accustomed to it. So you adapt. Your tolerance levels go up. Your pleasure percentage goes down. And so eventually you cross that invisible line of addiction, which is where you go from using something for a positive result to instead you go under that line, and now you're just using it to prevent a negative result. It means you are waking up during any given day and you're using it so that you don't feel terrible, not to feel better, right? And so for young guys, I think it always starts out with this delusion that like, I'm just use it to like, feel good once in a while, let kick back and let loose.
Yeah,
and,
play some video games, get high, watch
that
videos.
Kind of thing. Yep. It's always how it starts, and everyone deceives themselves into thinking they can keep it that way. No one can. Every time it has a track that inevitably goes to the same place. And the thing I see the most with young guys that use weed is they're using it to numb their anxiety. They can't fall asleep at night because their mind is wound up, and they're worrying about stuff the next day. They're worrying about their life path, their future. They're worried about this and that, and they can't sleep. And so what do? They smoke, they get high and numb themselves, and then it allows them to fall asleep. And contrary to some people out there that believe that's okay, it's not. When you smoke weed before you go to bed, you're actually turning off what are called glial cells in the brain. And when those are like the cells that are like the vacuum cleaners, they come on, alcohol does this too. They come on and they kind of clean out the waste from billions of neurons firing all day long. Yep. That's what allows you to feel refreshed when you wake up in the morning. That's why if you smoke weed right before bed, a lot of times, especially if you drink before bed, you're going to wait, you can sleep 10 hours. You wake up feeling like you slept 4 because the brain is groggy and it did not actually, go through the healing process that it needs to go through. So I see that all the time with like, guys that, smoke weed at a young age to numb their anxiety. Also important to mention, weed now versus weed even 10 years ago, night and day. It is not the weed like from even when you and I were growing up, even more recently than that, where it's like, it's not going to hit you that hard. And this stuff, like the THC content is very high. I've seen some young guys I've worked with that have smoked weed that have had psychotic symptoms from smoking weed. That's been happening more and more recently. Dab pens are more available now, which can't be detected by parents because they don't smell or that kind of thing. Edibles are now even more. I mean, there's like 4 dispensaries just on the road to my house now, where it's like people who are less than 20, younger than 21 are getting this stuff very easily. You talked about weed in the developing brain. It's just it's a bad idea to normalize this kind of stuff. And I think I know where Chris Long is coming from, but he has to recognize that if he's going to talk like that, he's got to give a balanced perspective about context of NFL players, high-performing athletes, and pain relief versus general use for young people, right? And I just wish he would at least go on the record to say something to a caveat to that. Sure. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So any other takeaways for you from just the Josh Gordon side of things now? Okay, we'll get into substance abuse in general. I think couple quick stats on substance abuse from drugabuse.gov and the CDC. 9% increase over the last 5 years in marijuana use among college students, 6% increase among non-college students. The U.S. reported a $740 billion loss due to drug and alcohol use stemming from missed work, healthcare costs, and crime. In a 12-month period ending in May 2020, over 81,000 overdose deaths happened, which is the most in a 12-month period ever. I would guarantee that if they don't have this yet, but when they have the 2020 stats as a year because of the pandemic and everything else, that's going to be off the charts. Yeah. The opioid crisis needs its own separate episode. Yeah. We'll get into that at some point. Some other data from the Addiction Centers of America: almost 21 million Americans have at least one addiction, yet only 10% of them get treatment. It's kind of scary. Drug overdose deaths have more than tripled since 1990. We've talked in a previous episode about how suicide rates have been going up too, and I think sometimes drug overdose is also suicide, and it's not recognized. People kind of using drugging themselves to death, drinking themselves to death. More than 90% of people who have an addiction started drinking alcohol or using drugs before they were 18 years old. And then Americans between the ages of 18 and 25 are most likely to use addictive drugs. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's the period between, you talked about how development of the brain kind of really finishes around 25 or 26, and yet we're being told we're adults at 18. And that it's called emerging adulthood. That 18 to 25-year-old period is really a challenge for people these days, especially because the bankability of a college degree is not what it used to be. And I think that screws a lot of people over because they graduate. If they go to college, they graduate, they're riddled with debt, and they don't have a real path to clear-cut work or a career, and the stress levels go up, financial resources go down, right? Not a coincidence. So to get into substance abuse and addiction a little bit, we're not going to go do like the DSM diagnosis here or anything like that, but I just want to cover some things that I think are important real quick. Addiction is not just to drugs. Like, that is really important for people to know. You can be addicted to a lot of different things. You can be addicted to, video games. You can be addicted to, I think the two biggest ones I see are gambling and porn, especially for young guys. Yeah. And both of those are normalized to the nth degree these days, right? Internet porn is a massive issue that's not being talked about enough.
No.
And then gambling is being legalized more and more. And I think there's the access to it through technology and different apps and stuff like that is only increasing. Both those are becoming massive issues, have been and are becoming massive issues. So it's not just to drugs. You can be addicted to a lot of different things, because addiction is more about the artificial chemical release in the brain than it is about an actual drug. And you don't need a drug to create that effect, right? I think with substance abuse and addiction, you have to know about the hereditary /family /environment factor. Addiction, especially to alcoholism runs in families.
Yep.
So you might be born into a family where you're prone to get it just because it's in your DNA.
Yep.
There's also the family aspect, which is, we talked about model behavior. If you're growing up around it, it's more normalized, that kind of thing. Let's see. So some signs, I want to get into some signs that maybe you or someone you know have an issue. To me, I'll probably kick it to you after this, but we get, poor decision-making is one. Financially spending a lot of money on drugs is also a huge warning sign, red flag. Avoiding other key parts of life is a big one, right? You start to see people avoid work, school, friends, family. Never a good sign. Usually means something's going on. Using while you're alone. Again, most people, young guys especially, they start by smoking weed with friends while playing video games and that kind of thing. Right. And inevitably it starts to transition into, I'll smoke by myself before I go to bed. When that starts to happen, that's a big time turning point. It's a red flag to look for. Use earlier and earlier in the day, right? If you're doing a little wake and bake when you get up, like that's not a good sign. If you're smoking to go to work, smoking to go to school, not a good idea. And then again, a key sign for me is that when the use becomes less about feeling good and more about not feeling terrible,
right?
Bad sign, right? Because now you've gone down the addiction curve to the point where the pleasure's not going to be high.
Right. You've crossed that threshold.
Yes. So any thoughts on just from the substance abuse angle for listeners?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest one that I usually highlight is that, looking for big behavior changes, right? So, someone who was active all the time, really enjoyed going out, riding bikes, being outside, doing whatever, and now is all of a sudden sort of secluding themselves to their room. It doesn't necessarily mean substance abuse. I think that's something important to highlight.
Especially now in 2020 with trying to stay in and be safe. And
right,
that kind of thing,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So I don't want to alarm people about that piece, but, typically looking for something where someone was doing something on a consistent basis and then switching that behavior, that's sort of like a curiosity point of like, why, right? And so that's definitely one of the bigger things that I sort of look for, that loss, like not pursuing things that they were doing, the lethargy you talked about. I agree. I don't like the word lazy. It's just not an appropriate term to use when identifying or labeling somebody. But someone who was sort of driven towards goals and now all of a sudden is not. Those are some of those key factors that I try to look at when working with somebody, or if I'm hearing someone talk to me about someone that they're concerned about. Those are some of the questions that I usually ask, kind of like screening and try to figure out what might be going through or going on. Yeah,
absolutely. We touched on, for me, the percentage of those dealing with addiction who have underlying trauma is a big thing to look out for. If you know someone with substance abuse issues, it's good to at least consider what else they may have gone through, because there's a good chance they went through something that they might not even be aware of. Again, denial is a huge coping mechanism, and sometimes it's unconscious. People block out trauma to be able to just go through life. And so sometimes therapy is really helpful in this, because you're unpacking those layers to really get to what's driving the substance use. So, show some empathy, I think, is first for other people, because there's a good chance there's other stuff going on. And if you're someone listening who has a substance abuse issue, try to look back at your past and try to figure out, did I go through something traumatic on some level that may be driving this? And the definition of trauma has changed. I know, it's most often identified with military-based PTSD, but it's not just that. I mean, it really can be physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse of any kind, neglect in youth, even bullying. I've worked with some guys where they've been significantly bullied and they have some either full-blown PTSD or some signs of it, that kind of thing. So be aware of the trauma, that you may have gone through, or that people that with substance abuse issues that may have substance abuse issues may have gone through some trauma as well.
I think you make a good point about trying to come at those conversations through a lens of empathy. Yes. I think we often blame first, and
especially for substance abuse.
For substance abuse, like just the comments like I hear, like just stop, like why can't they just stop, or why, I think we've talked about this earlier in this episode, just kind of feeds that shame. Like trying to come to that conversation through a sense of empathy is far more effective.
Totally. So a couple other bullet points. I talked in a past episode about how substance use is, I like to refer to it as borrowed happiness on the next day, because it really is. It doesn't come for free. Anytime you're numbing yourself with a substance or some kind of addictive behavior, because again, it might not be a drug, you're borrowing that natural happiness the next day. You're setting yourself back, and that catches up to you pretty quick. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. Also, just caution people that nothing, what I like to say to people, nothing healthy exists that feels as good as instantly as drugs or like an addictive chemical release. It doesn't exist, and you have to accept that instead of having an accept versus expect. You can't expect to find something on a scale of a day that's natural and healthy that's going to feel as good as something like a drug or some kind of addictive chemical release. It doesn't exist. So you have to accept that first, start from that place, and then try to build healthy habits on top of it.
Yeah, you have to understand it's going to be harder work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But more rewarding long term.
Yes.
I think long term you're actually building up to like a healthy sense of self and a much more rewarding, joyful life. It just takes time to kind of build that. Yeah. And it's never going to, again, pleasure versus joy. Those are not the same thing, right? You'll have more joy. You might not have as much pleasure, but pleasure is a chemical thing, and you got to be careful with identifying that with happiness or joy. Yep. Let's see. So another key thing to consider is how, the reliance on any addiction or numbing from problems can be a gateway. So meaning, it's not just, weed. I know people say weed is not a gateway drug. Anything that leads to the brain relying on, the artificial release of chemicals to numb yourself from life is a gateway.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it's weed or if it's porn use or if it's gambling or if it's heroin. They're all gateway things because you're conditioning your brain to need that artificial chemical release to get by, to get through life. That's always a gateway because that's the way the path of addiction works. It starts with that, and you adjust, right?
Yeah.
Your ability to adapt, your brain develops a tolerance. You need more the next time.
Yep.
Sometime that drug becomes not good enough, so you step it up to the next drug. That's how this stuff works, right? Yep. So anything can be a gateway in that sense. Let's see. So in terms of steps to take for people, I think for me, the first step is to just be honest with yourself. You got to be aware of denial. It's a very, very common coping mechanism, and it's never more present than it is with substance abuse because the addiction wants you to think you can keep doing it. It's going to try to trick you. It wants you to justify the use. It wants you to put that as the priority. You got to admit where your brain is lying to your mind a little bit. Hopefully without having to hit rock bottom. We talked about Josh Gordon and how he had to hit rock bottom before he recognized that. Let's hope that people listening, if they have some substance abuse issues, they're able to head off the problem before they have to hit rock bottom. Yeah. So that's the first one. Be honest with yourself and be aware of denial. The second one is get support as much as possible, right? The right friends and family. Yes. We have the SAMHSA National Helpline in our show notes. It's 1-800-662-HELP. That's a way to connect to some possible resources on substance use. I think when it comes to getting support, I don't know about you, but one thing I look to do with clients is not just get them connected to the right family, but it's get the wrong people out.
Yes.
That is an absolute necessity. Is like there's usually people enabling you, other users who, misery loves company. Like they want you to keep using because it will justify their continued use. Sometimes you got to erase numbers out of your phone and you got to disconnect from some people in order to prioritize your own health and well-being. So it's getting support, but it's also getting rid of the wrong people. Would you agree?
Yeah, I when I talk about this with clients, I call about either friendship inventory or support network inventory, right? Like go through the people you surround yourself with and really analyze what do they bring to me. Are they supporting my actual growth or joy? Are they?
Do you actually write this out too?
Yeah, I have them sort of go through as a process of sort of like, let's make a tree of your support.
That's great.
And really try to figure out, are these people contributing
to
your benefit and contributing to your pursuit of joy, or are they detracting?
Yeah.
And it's a hard process because oftentimes, to your point, the people who are, sucking or feeding or contributing to their substance use are some of the people they feel the closest with because like
loyalty
you said,
or
loyalty
support
or
at a bad time. Yeah.
Giving permission for them to continue to do that, and that brain wants to stay in that place, and so it sometimes leads to hard conversations. But having a really effective support network, and I say support network, not necessarily family, because sometimes family isn't the support network, and so you want to have a firm sense of support going through this. I think that's one of the most crucial things. We talked about this previously, but about asking for help and being okay with accepting help. And I think having the right people in your corner to be able to do that is really important. And, one of the disclaimers that we always put up when we're talking about resources or sort of like tips and strategies for people dealing with these different mental health issues is, yes, finding a good support network, but finding the right professional to be working with is paramount, right? When you're working with substance abuse issues, that's definitely one of the things that you have to be working with someone that's going to be able to coordinate these different things for you, helping you get in the right, meeting with the right person, helping to sort of go through these different processes is just it's absolutely essential. And I really want to emphasize that you don't have to do this alone. If you're struggling with this, or if you know someone who is, seek support from the people who do this work, because the path to treatment is possible. There's plenty of people who go through this who find success with going through that. That's got to be one of the first steps of like getting to that place of finding the people that are going to be helped to give you the support that you actually need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going through an inventory is really a great way to do it, because you're really writing it out one by one, and you're giving intentional thought to it instead of just glossing it over quickly. It does require a lot of thought, a lot of planning, because these are hard decisions. It's never easy to let go of certain people. It's very difficult to do. So I agree with that. I think harm reduction is another key concept for people. That's a bit of a substance abuse jargony term, but I'll explain it. Harm reduction means, a lot of people, especially parents, do this. They think that when their son or daughter is struggling with substance abuse, that it's a black and white, cut and dry, all or nothing thing. Like, no use allowed, right? You have to stop, or else you'll be punished and grounded for life. And that substance use does not work that way. Like, relapse is absolutely part of the process. And if you expect perfection, you're going to be really disappointed, and you're going to set people up for failure. You have to understand that relapse is part of that process, and it happens gradually sometimes, and they need your support when they fall off, even more than when they're doing well, right? So we have to understand that harm reduction is about, instead of expecting perfection, how do we set them up to reduce harm as much as possible, right? We're reducing that harm. That means considering safety. It means, all right, if you're going to use, try to use a little bit less just to keep yourself safe. If you're out and you've used, don't get behind the wheel of a car. Don't let someone else drive you who's been using. Like, it's looking for ways to say, all right, we're being honest that perfection's not possible. Let's try to reduce the harm as much as possible, so that, and it includes like stepping down sometimes. So instead of just quitting cold turkey, how can we reduce that and be realistic about it? So harm reduction is a key approach. Changing your environment is really important, and not just temporarily, like a vacation. Some of these like nice rehab facilities out in Arizona, I get it. It's a great place to go to get treatment, but that place does not resemble what you're coming back to. And people have to recognize that you have to change your own environment as much as possible to resemble what you need it to be post-rehab, or even if you didn't go to rehab, because there's usually aspects of your environment that are driving some of your addictive behaviors. And you need to change those in order to, we talked with about Josh Gordon moving 7 times, right? You need to have a stable environment, home environment, and you need to be able to put things in place in that environment that are going to support your recovery.
Right.
Let's see. And then the last one is just understand your triggers and confront them at the right pace. You got to know which things are going to make you most likely to relapse. This is part of harm reduction too. Identifying your triggers and then trying to kind of attack them at the right pace, meaning, we've talked in the past about the zone of proximal development, which is the 20% rule. You always want to be kind of 20% out of your comfort zone, so that you're not pushing yourself too little, but you're also not pushing yourself too much. If you're trying to quit a substance and you have a number one trigger, and you just try to get rid of that like off the bat, or let's say you try to face it in its worst scenario right off the bat. I'm thinking like let's say a person smokes cigarettes, right? And their main trigger is coffee in the morning, right? When they go to Dunkin' Donuts or something like that, like they get coffee, and that the smell and the drinking the coffee makes them want, right? If you try to confront that right away, there's a good chance you're going to be trying to bite off more than you can chew. So let's try to take care of some other triggers, face those, and leave that one for last, and then learn to change that association, change that routine or habit to be able to set ourselves up to do things differently moving forward. So it's understanding your triggers is really key, and then confront them systematically, usually easiest to hardest. You want to confront those things.
Yeah, and substituting more healthy behaviors and more healthy types of things that are going to be more beneficial than picking up the substance or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to remove the associations, because if you keep the associations in place, it's going to keep triggering you to want to use.
It's going to keep going.
So we're going to give an example of Grim Drive today. I wanted to talk about, quickly just mention Kobe Bryant and the Mamba mentality. Obviously as a Boston fan, Celtics fan, he was someone that going up against him was, we always rooted against him, but I think always had a lot of respect for him as an athlete and his determination and creating the Mamba mentality and what that meant. And, this episode's coming out on the exact, I think, 1-year anniversary of him passing away. So I thought it would be good to at least call some attention to him, and because I think he is an example of Grim Drive for sure. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, his pursuit of being great at his individual sport, not just basketball, but just him as a human being, you don't find many people like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a quick reminder to people listening, just to click subscribe on your podcast listening platform and give us a rate and a review if possible. We really appreciate all the feedback. We're going to offer a pair of free Celtics tickets to a game in 2021 to 2022. We'll also, offer tickets to a different game if you're not a Celtics fan or you're out of Boston, you want to see a different game. We're happy to do that. So if one lucky person is going to win 2 tickets to a game out of all who write an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021, you can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the contact us option on our website at grimdrive.com. It's going to ask you for your name and email address, and we'll provide you with the option to upload the screenshot file. Just make sure you take the screenshot of the review before you click submit, and then upload that to the website. One other reminder, all the helpful information and links and some of the data we mentioned today can be accessed in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Josh Gordon and substance abuse. We will be back next time to talk about Robin Lehner and PTSD.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone, for listening.